Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The West appears to have entered into a new era, the era of political upsets, growing anger, and increased disillusionment with ruling elites. It's not a question of left-wing, right-wing politics. It's all about a failing status quo. Crosstalking a new era in politics. I'm joined by my guest, Stephen Haysler in London. He is the director of the Global Policy Institute, as well as author of the upcoming book, England Alone. Also in London, we have Marcus Papadopoulos. He is the editor of Politics First magazine. And in Belgrade, we cross to Joaquin Flores. He is a political strategist and journalist. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Marcus, let me go to you first in London. So much has happened over the last few months. I decided to do a big picture program of what is some of the forces that are in play across the Atlantic world, the Western world here. We all know what the major milestones are. So my question is, are we entering into a new political era? And if we are, how would you describe it? Go ahead.
Yes, I do think we are entering into a new era. There are certainly massive changes taking place. And, you know, ordinary people in Britain, in America, in France and Germany, for many, many years, they have felt taken for granted. Their views have been neglected. Their views have been denigrated. And there's a lot of public frustration out there. And we certainly can say that that's a major factor in Brexit. I think it's a major factor in the victory of Trump. But I don't think we should go down the road of saying that a revolution is on its way, because we really need to understand what a revolution is. And of course, we can look to the French Revolution and to the Russian Revolution. There is not going to be a revolution in America. There is not going to be a revolution in Britain. But I think there are significant changes on the way.
You know, Stephen, I like the phrase draining the swamp, and I think that is a universal attitude that many people across the Atlantic world want to see. They're really tired of the status quo because the status quo doesn't serve them, and it seems to serve other people, and a very small minority of people. And like I said in the introduction of this program, it's not only left-wing, right-wing. It is against the establishment, and I would say the media to a large extent as well. Go ahead, Stephen, in London.
Yes, well, I think I agree with that, but most people seem to forget that about 10 years ago there was something called a global financial crash.
Yep.
What basically happened was the Western economic system imploded, and what that led to, and it's led to it slowly year by year because the elite have just patched it up, is that large numbers of people began falling out of the system. And what you have in the Western world now, both in the Rust Belt in the United States, in the north of England, which accounts for Brexit, in southern Europe particularly, though not particularly in northern Europe, what you have are large numbers of people who've just lost out on globalization, who the whole younger generation have no hope, and who these folks live on low wages, day-by-day household budget crises. And the fact of the matter is, and this is what I consider to be rather strange, that our elites in the Western world did not pick this up. They didn't notice it.
They still haven't.
And this was one of the great troubles. Well, the elites in the West...
They haven't.
What?
They haven't picked up on it yet, okay? Remarkably so. They still want to push back.
No, they haven't. I understand. No, I understand. Yes, I understand that the London media and the New York media are sending search parties now out into America and into northern England to find what's going on. And the problem is, it is a problem with the media. Yeah. There's no question about this. It's a problem with the media. These guys have very large salaries, live in very nice parts of Britain, and are not feeling the pinch like their population. And we shouldn't be surprised there's a backlash. And I agree with your previous speaker here. It's not left and right. It's a backlash against a rather selfish, uncaring establishment that's been running the Western world for about the last 20 to 30 years.
Joaquin in Belgrade, weigh in here, because my original question is, are we entering a new era of politics? What's your take on it? Go ahead.
This is absolutely a new era in politics, but I think we have to back up and sort of to piggyback on the last couple of speakers. I would say that it's not only an issue of the elites being out of touch with this. I think that there is a little bit more intention here. I think that there's enough evidence. I think there's been enough documentation, enough public policy papers that have discussed this, talking about the need for austerity, the need to equalize conditions and wages throughout the world. So as we will see generally a decrease of wages, conditions, and living conditions and so forth in Western Europe and North America. So I would only sort of weigh in to say that in addition to everything that's been said, I would agree, except for this idea that this has struck the elite by surprise. I think that it's not a surprise, and rather they are carrying out a rather well-conceived policy to a certain extent. Of course, not without a lot of stumbles and stepbacks, but nevertheless, it's on purpose.
Well, Marcus, I think it's quite clear that this establishment, this transatlantic establishment, they're not going anywhere fast. I mean, they're going to push back. They definitely don't want to lose all the perks that they have accumulated over the last few decades, at the expense, I would say, of middle classes. Go ahead, Marcus.
Yes, I would agree with that. But I don't believe this has just happened in the last 10 years or so. An argument I would make, and it's often been overlooked or not even considered at all, that ever since the collapse of communism, a new form of capitalism took over in Western Europe, what I would call an ultra form of capitalism, very similar to what you have in the United States. And this form of capitalism that we have in Britain today, and I think in France and Germany, is all about making as much money as you can and by any means necessary, including walking over people. And therefore, I think a lot of people in Western Europe have lost their stability that they once enjoyed, have lost their security, and they have been just left out in the cold. And I think that is a big reason for why it's taken a long time. But I think people are starting to fight back now. And we even see it in Eastern Europe and in the former Yugoslavia, countries which were once communist, and they had security, they had stability, they had full employment, there was no homelessness, people had homes. They've lost all that, and I think that, yes, certainly the financial crash from 2008 has brought this to the floor, but I really think the fact that in Western Europe we have this ultra form of capitalism is a very, very big factor. Britain, I can say this from now, Peter, the British system is becoming more and more like the American system, and I consider the American system to be an inhumane system. Everything in Britain now is becoming privatised. You know, people are suffering. You know, there's something like over 1.5 million people in Britain who are dependent on food banks, i.e. charities for their food. There are nearly 3 million children in Britain who live below the poverty line. You know, these are terrible, terrible things, and, you know, we're starting to see what I would call a backlash now.
Yeah, Stephen, you know, the thing is that it's really interesting. I think, you know, the end of the Cold War was the beginning of something different when it came to capitalism. But I think very broadly, neoliberalism made two promises, essentially, security and prosperity. And it can't deliver on either one now. It hasn't for a while. And I think this is what part of that backlash, you know, the implicit promise that you would get these two pillars, and they don't deliver anymore. Go ahead, Stephen.
Well, I just wanted to make a point that I don't think it's just capitalism. I think what it is globalization.
Okay.
That when capitalism was national and capitalism was controlled by the Western societies, it produced a good middle class and a good standard of living, far better than you found in the communist countries. What happened since the end of communism is we've had the addition of huge numbers of people into the labour market, which has lowered wages and caused all these jobs to disappear from the Western world. So that's a feature of globalization, and our Western elites, of course, mainly the big companies, done very well out of this. Large numbers of people have done extremely badly out of it, and it's simply a factor of globalization. So I think that what you're seeing with Trump and what we may be seeing in Europe as well, possibly, is an increasing notion of protectionism, whereby we intervene in this globalized world so that politicians and countries can have more control over these transnational corporations and capital. This is essentially the big problem. The hollowing out of Western economies is the essential problem here.
Well, you know, Joaquin, it's very interesting, as we mentioned the former communist Eastern Europe. You know, it's really interesting that these elites in these countries have been co-opted into the neoliberal elite club, okay? Again, at odds with their own populations. There's this political correctness, there's this postmodernism, but I've lived in Eastern Europe. I spent many, many years there. It's not postmodern, okay? And don't force it. Go ahead, Joaquin.
That's right. And in fact, when we look at the issues in this region, of course, talking about the Balkans and since the collapse of socialism, and the neoliberals were born from some of the very end of the last class of bureaucrats from the socialist system. And so this has, made a very different, unique discourse in Eastern Europe, where from time to time you encounter whole broad sections of the population who associate socialism and communism with the liberal elites who took power subsequently, or who inherited the reins of power. And so it creates, an upsurge of popular nationalist reaction, a similar one that we might see in Western Europe that the left would champion. So we have a sort of period where we're really moving past these ideas of left and right, because they kind of don't describe the situation as well as I think other concepts would. For example, if we talk in terms of the people versus the elites, or the bottom versus the top, we get a much clearer picture of what's going on. Then we talk about left and right with its allusions to the French Revolution, and it's not very clear what's going on when we talk about left and right. And for a lot of reasons, personal life experience, psychological, people are emotional beings. They might just not be attracted to the term left or to the term right, and so they're blocking themselves off from a lot of very powerful and relevant ideas on both ends that might help them and social movements to correct some of the problems that we're facing right now. So
okay,
yes.
After a short break, we'll continue our discussion on a new era in politics. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing a new era in politics. Okay, I'd like to go back to Stephen in London. Right before we went to the break, I mentioned the disintegration of the Blairite, Clintonite paradigm that we saw right after the end of the Cold War. But with the collapse of this paradigm, there's also, and I think it's an important discussion, it seems to me that now there's an aversion to direct democracy, to popular democracy, because, well, according to the elites, people vote the wrong way. And we saw two great examples of that last year. And I'm thinking they're not very chastened about it. And that's one of the things I don't see, that they're taking any kind of post-mortem about how people actually feel about politics. We have to keep in mind, too, that a lot of the polling agencies, very liberal themselves, got a lot of the polls wrong when people went to the ballot box. Go ahead, Stephen.
Well, I mean, are you talking about Brexit here? I mean, is this one of the issues?
Yes.
That, well, let's put it this way. One of the problems we have here in Britain is that even though, of course, globalization caused this tremendous problem with a lot of people being left out, often when people have their say, and this is the problem with direct democracy, when people have their say, they don't vote on the issue. They just vote to kick the establishment out. We saw this in Britain, in fact. It wasn't really about the European Union. It was about migration. It was about not being listened to by London. It was about having their family incomes in trouble. And so people voted against the establishment, whatever the establishment wanted. And I think one cautionary point ought to be made in this environment, and I agree with what everybody's said up to now about this, but one cautionary point ought to be made, that if we go over now to populism and we go over to direct democracy, often the decisions taken can be wrong. In other words, you can get a decision taken which has nothing to do with the actual problem facing the people. I think that's what's happened in this country, for instance, on the Brexit vote. That we are now finding ourselves out of the European Union, even though a majority of people did not vote on that issue at all. They voted on other issues. So I think we've got to be very careful about populism as it develops. Although, you know, I have to say, one can understand why the people of the Western world are not listening to their elites anymore.
Okay, well, you know, Marcus, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes,
you want to jump in there?
Can
Go
I
ahead,
very
please.
quickly jump in, Peter? Yeah, I just want to comment on Brexit. At the outset, I want to say I'm no fan of the European Union for ideological and foreign policy reasons. But there are no easy explanations for Brexit, and for anyone to argue that the Brexit result was a consequence of people rising up, of people power, it really is nonsense. You know, for decades, British media neglected to inform the British public about the European Union. And surprise, surprise, when the British people went to the ballot boxes last year to vote, many of them really didn't understand what they were voting about. I mean, economics is a very difficult area at the best of times to comprehend. You throw the European Union into that, and it makes it possibly even worse than rocket science. And I would say this, how many people in Britain are aware that since that during the 1980s and the 1990s, the European Union was subsidising some of the poorest parts of Britain, for example, Liverpool and Manchester and Glasgow. Why did the European Union step in? Because consecutive Conservative governments, from Thatcher to Major, deliberately starved those areas of money because they were Labour Party supporting areas. But many British people just were not aware of that. And I would also add this as well. I'm actually against referendums, you know, on such complicated issues. We elect politicians to make these decisions, to take these tough decisions. And the fact that David Cameron decided to hold this referendum, not for the interests of Britain, but for internal Conservative Party reasons, is really shameful. Yeah. And so, you know, surprise, surprise, you know, many English people, and I say English, not British, really didn't understand what they were voting for. And you know, we're talking about fake news at the moment. Yeah, but many journalists in Britain.
There's got to be a point though where, you know, I mean, either you have democracy or you don't. Okay, I mean. I find it a little
but it's got to be informed.
It's got to be informed. Well, that's my constant mantra of criticizing the media, because the media always does that. It always muddies the water for the elites, for the establishment. I still see this going on nonstop in the United States. I mean, went through an entire news cycle about what Donald Trump said about Sweden. I mean, that's why that country is in crisis, okay? Well, let me go to Joaquin.
But look what British media has said about the referendum in Britain. British media is saying that the British people overwhelmingly decided for Brexit. That's not true. 51% is not a decisive result. 51% is not emphatic.
Yeah. Gentlemen, we have to have equal time here. We have to. Go ahead, Joaquin. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's absolutely true, of course, that 51% is not an overwhelming majority, but it was a vote, and that was the outcome, and that was what was sufficient for whatever process to take place. But I would really take issue. We're arriving at an age where this is a new era in politics because people are disgusted with elites. And I want to point out that one of these attitudes that elites have is that the people are incapable of making decisions themselves. When they vote on something in a popular referendum, we've got to be worried that they voted the wrong way. And I have to say that the direct democracy, that the popular referendum is the closest thing to any kind of direct democratic mechanism that has ever existed in the Western world. And to be against that really puts yourself, unfortunately, in the same boat as the elites, who are always constantly afraid that the poor people really just don't know what's good for them. And of course, it's a complicated issue, and it can be simplified. But nevertheless, that's democracy.
All right, who wants to jump in?
Hold on. No, that's not democracy. No. That's a complete misreading of democracy. By the way, one big question, what are we going to have referendums on in the future? Everything? Do we have a referendum on every subject that comes up? On raising taxes, lowering taxes, immigration, no immigration, capital punishment, no capital punishment? No, the problem is
under the present conditions of technology, certainly that certainly could. Absolutely.
Which is one of the problems I think we had with David Cameron.
Okay.
If you start trying to run a society on the basis of referendums, it will collapse.
Okay, Marcus, I want to stay with. No, that's a fair point, Marcus. I want to stay with democracy here, because, again, if we take the timeline. Since the end of the Cold War, and maybe it was the disintegration of the middle classes even before that, you know, people don't have their wages aren't increasing. It's very expensive to put their kids through school. People are thinking about security. I mean, so many layers have been cut away, and the only thing they have left, the only thing they have is the ballot. That's the one thing they're not taking away from them. And I'm not surprised people vote in a very angry way. I think the Trump victory it wasn't just white angry men. It was white people, angry people, and angry people. I mean, all across the board. And I think that that's why we have to worry about where democracy goes, because if that's the last thing you give people, that's the last thing you haven't taken away from them, they're going to react in these ways. And that accounts, to a large extent, the rise of nationalism in Europe. Go ahead, Marcus.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I don't think democracy in the West is in a very good state whatsoever. And I certainly understand why there is what I call a backlash at the moment going on in Britain, in America, in the Netherlands, let's not forget, in Denmark, in France, and Germany. But, I still hold true to this view that many people are just not fully in the picture. And I can only cite Brexit once again. There are no clear-cut answers for what happened in Brexit. If we have a look in Scotland, people voted overwhelmingly to stay there. And I would say a big factor in explaining Brexit is that the people who voted in favour of it are largely were the English people. And the difference between the English and the Scots is that the English have this imperial mindset, and many people in UKIP, for example, who like to project themselves as being friends of Russia when they're not genuine friends of Russia. They're just using Russia as a weapon against the European Union. But many of these people in UKIP, Peter, they are staunchly pro-American. And I've been to their events before, and they portray Britain and America as the guardians of democracy in the world, the guardians of civilization. So while I understand why people voted for UKIP, and I really do understand that, at the same time I would be very cautious a lot of these groups which are springing up in Europe, because they are not genuine friends of Russia.
Marcus, I think I saw. Hang on here, doesn't mean to interject here. I saw UKIP's documentary right before Brexit, and it was this unending criticism of Brussels, but it was a globalist agenda. It was totally globalist economically. So I see your point here. I'm sorry, Joaquin, jump in Belgrade. Go ahead.
Yeah, you know what it is that we have at the end of the day is a relatively easy way of understanding this and a complicated way of understanding it. And I think that to simplify things is just as problematic as to overcomplicate it. But the fundamental issue here is that people are not happy with so-called experts getting on television, telling that they voted the wrong way, that they don't understand the issues. That is precisely what universally experts agree that this uprising, this so-called uprising, is all about. So these are the things that we should try to avoid and not reinforce, I think. And I would, follow up with that and really just say, look, whether the decisions that Trump will make, talking about the United States, as a direction are right or wrong for the best interest or worst interest of people, whether in England Brexit works out as it was thought or doesn't, is entirely separate from what is motivating people. I think that's the core issue here. What is motivating people? Why are they outraged? Who has failed them? And I think it is this globalized, capitalist, first world elite, these who dominate the liberal and center-right conservative spheres. So I think that's what people are outraged about. Okay,
Stephen, I'll give you the last word in the program. During the Munich Security Conference, we heard Foreign Minister Lavrov use the term post-West era. 20 seconds. Do you agree with that?
Agree.
Well, I think there's a lot in it. It is a new era. Absolutely, and I think we're seeing big changes in the tectonic plates across the world. And we're seeing the Western world maybe dividing into two Wests in the United States and in Western Europe. So these are big changes, but they've fundamentally been caused, in my view, because the Western economic system is not delivering to the average folk what it used to deliver. It's as simple as that.
Gentlemen,
and we've got to get it back.
We've run out of time, gentlemen. Many thanks to my guests in London and in Belgrade. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules. I love it.